All right. Welcome, everybody, to another speedrun episode. I'm reminding the people watching on YouTube that as a result of the excellent feedback, I've decided to switch back to primarily the 15 plus 10 time control. But on days where I'm a little bit more tired, we also might do 10-minute games. And I think tonight is a 10-minute night, particularly for the more beginner level games. We get a lot of situations where people spend, 7-8 minutes just in a lost position. So I think 10-minute games might be a little bit more efficient. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to play 10 plus 0. And that is also rapid time control chess killer 2416. Very intimidating. D4, okay. So we've already faced a London system. D4, D5, okay. So obviously this is not in the kind of general category of commonly accepted moves, but it's actually not that bad. The move D5 it's often played by this GM named Ray Robson, one of the top American GMs in Bullet. And it's actually kind of a hard move to play against, but only if white follows it up very carefully. So our response doesn't really change. We can still play the King's Indian setup. For the time being, we'll start by developing our king side, and then hopefully we'll be able to demonstrate the drawbacks of pushing this pawn up to D5 this early. So bishop G7. We need to cross our T's and dot our I's. I always get that one wrong. Okay, castle. So now the king side is developed, and we can sort of get down to business, by which I mean trying to punish white for overextending in the center. Bishop E3, slightly weird move. This type of move is usually not very good because it locks in the bishop on F1. Of course, white could fianchetto it, but all of that is going to be very time-consuming, and hopefully I can create a situation where white's center is under fire, and white pays the price for not developing efficiently. So white has this pawn chain on C4 and D5. The basic idea is that white's idea is to make it difficult for us to develop our knight and develop our bishop and essentially to operate. So we want to get rid of the pawn. This is the basic concept of this position. We want to get rid of it. To get rid of it, we need to use one of our own pawns. So you should be thinking in the direction of E6 or C6. I like the move C6 more. Wow, knight BD2 was pre-move. But the main one is because it opens up a nice little avenue for our queen. And the second reason is that if white plays D takes C6, we would have been able to recapture a pawn and also develop a piece. Now this simply blunders a pawn. We just take. Okay, suddenly our opponent has switched into bullet mode. Queen to C2, another slightly strange move. We're just going to keep developing our pieces. Okay, knight to D4. Okay, so our opponent is offering a trade of knights, but remember that the kind of most common tenet that you should follow as early as the beginner stage is your default should be to keep the tension. So let's say that there's the possibility of trading. You should only trade if there is a good reason to trade. And actually in this situation, I don't like the move knight takes D4 because it allows the bishop to reposition itself from a very awkward square onto a square where it contests our bishop, and it'll make it easier for white to then develop the king side. So knight d4 doesn't actually threaten anything. We can simply proceed with our normal development. Now, what do we need to do? We need to develop this bishop, so let's just go d6. Okay, knight b3. Now we can basically initiate, I think, the decisive invasion, shall we say. Now, there's a million ways that we could win this game, but of course, I'm kind of concentrating my attention in the center because we have this massive phalanx of pawns, and the natural thing to do would be to set them in motion. So most of you are probably thinking, let's go e5, but let's modify the move order a little bit. Let's take on d4 first so that white doesn't have like a little escape route with knight takes c6, and white isn't able to gain a tempo for his defense. So let's go e5. Now the bishop is chased back, and we'll go d4, driving in a very nasty wedge. But before we go d4, we can throw in the move bishop f5 with tempo. So notice that I'm not playing automatically. I'm pausing for a second. I'm like, wait a second. This move has 0 downsides. In fact, it's got a major upside. Yeah, queen d2. And now we don't go d4 at all, because d4 maybe allows bishop h6. Of course, it's also winning, but dc is much more efficient. It wins another pawn. And white is just getting suffocated here. You can't play an entire game without your king side. It's as simple as that. Knight a5. So this is an instructive situation because, well, it's a very tactically charged situation. You should notice that the knight on a5 is hanging by a single thread. So if we were able to kick this queen away from the diagonal, we would win the knight. Unfortunately, it's not that easy to do because knight e4, white has this move queen to b4. And that's a bit of a dead end. Maybe some of you are noticing the interference tactic c3. If our rook was on c8, this would be even stronger. Now, c3 is actually a very good move, and it's a very deep move, because after queen takes c3, and we're going to play it, we're going to start with c3. We're not necessarily trying to win the knight here. We're combining. We're hunting for the knight, but we're also trying to induce sort of other concessions in white's position. So what move here not only kind of tries to get the queen to lose contact with the knight, but also prepares to cash in our chips? What am I talking about? Yeah, there's a couple of good moves here. It's a totally winning position. But what am I implying here? Yeah, knight to d5. So we're hitting the queen, but you might be like, well, what's so great about this move? The queen can just drop back to d2, for example. But then we take the bishop all of a sudden. And white can't take back with a queen. Okay, so our opponent blunders the knight, but the point would have been, as I'll show after the game, to induce this horrific damage to, and fatal damage to white's pawn structure. Maybe this is not the best way to win, but it's one of several. Let's start by taking the bishop, though. First, eliminate the bishop, and then take the knight. White can play knight takes b7 here. And perhaps that move scared some of you, but in that position, we had knight c2 check, forcing a bunch of trades. Now, we're just totally winning. We're up a piece, and the rest is going to be really simple. Hoping for resignation here, but probably not going to get it. Okay, so I say this every single speed run. It's important to reiterate that in a situation like this, it's not that queen b6 or queen takes d2, one move is better than the other. It's literally purely a matter of taste. For some people, it's easier to convert while keeping the queens on the board, which kind of should be your default. For other people, particularly for newer players, it can be simpler to exchange pieces, but not indiscriminately. This is the point I always try to make. Trading when you're up a ton of material is usually great. It often simplifies the task, but you shouldn't just close your eyes and initiate every single trade that you can. For now, I'm doing that because it's benefiting me, and we can take control of the C file, but that doesn't mean I'm going to deliberately seek out a trade of the last pair of rooks. Okay, so this whole concept of trading when you're up material, you have to apply it on a case-by-case basis. It's a good rule of thumb, but if you're mating somebody, don't go out of your way to suddenly trade the queens just because, I'm supposed to trade when I'm up material. All you're supposed to do is win the game, however you want to do it. Okay, so rook c2 here would be a little bit sloppy. Perhaps you can test yourself. It's not that it loses or anything. Actually, we do have a pretty cool tactic there. So no, let's go rook c2. I managed to make it work. Yeah, g4. Okay, well, our opponent, of course, misses it, but after the game, I'll show you what the issue was after g4. Now we just start taking stuff. Rook takes f2, rook takes b2, doesn't matter what we do. This is the boring part. I'll try to make it quick. And for beginner players watching this on YouTube, I would say maybe players very approximately chess.com rapid, maybe 800 and under. Even though this is a very boring exercise, if you want to work on your conversion, one thing that you can do is set this position up and actually play stockfish. For example, from this position, can you reliably convert this position with black against the computer? Now, it might be a bit of a deflation thing for your ego if you lose, but that's to be expected, right? I also lose totally winning positions against the computer. It's a great way to practice your technique and your confidence and to basically trial and error your way through various types of conversions until you find a method that you're more comfortable with. Let's go b5. Max stockfish level, yeah. You should be able to convert that position against the max stockfish level. So we're going to go bishop d3. I'm already setting up the mating net. And the mating net will involve bishops on d3 and c3 that crisscross the board and set up rook b1 mate. This is what I'm trying to set up. So what's our next move going to be? Yes, e4, and then bishop c3 and rook b1. And if white plays e4 themselves, then of course it opens up a different vista for the bishop. We go bishop h6, and that's also unstoppable checkmate. So again, anytime a pawn is moved, somewhere in the world, a diagonal is opened, a square is cleared, You have to get into that habit of automatically assessing, no matter what position we're talking about. Okay, here we're checkmating the guy like 7 ways to Sunday, but in general, pawn moves create kind of a different strategic situation on the board. You have to be aware of what squares are opened up, what diagonals are open and closed. Pawn moves have tremendous impact in almost any position. So bishop c3 is coming, and then rook b1 is mate. We took down the chess killer. Very pumped. Okay, this is the downside of of like this time control. Okay, g4, but our opponent is not stalling. I think they're earnestly trying to find a way out. And checkmate. Okay, so a quick run through. This was not too complicated of a game, but nevertheless, good little introduction to some basic points of the King's Indian. Okay, so d4 knight f6 d5. Again, this is not a terrible move. It's not as bad as playing like g4 on move 1, which, by the way, little trivia fact, the worst move, according to the engine, is in fact the grob g4. I'm pretty sure that at a high depth, white is like borderline losing strategically after d5. So this is not, that level of bad, but it's very, very dubious, especially if white doesn't follow it up properly. Okay, so we start by completing our kind of King's Indian setup, bishop g7, knight f3 castles. So here, the proper way to develop for white would have been knight to c3. And I've actually never analyzed this, this line properly. So I'm going to check very quickly with Stockfish what the engine recommends here. And I will let you know in about 10 seconds. My guess would be just like we played in the game, either c6 or e6, but you also sometimes want to start with d6 and delay c6 until a proper moment has arrived. Yeah, so the eval here is actual equality. It's not like black is better. According to Stockfish, you're supposed to start with d6. Now, typically, white plays e4. Logical. And yeah, just as we did in the game, I'm seeing a lot of high-level games here, by the way. Jobava, Giri, Fedoseev versus Zherobuk. So some GMs have played this, mostly in like rapid and blitz time control. The computer likes e6. Now, typically, white is not going to play d takes e6 because that plays into our hands. And after bishop e6, we just have like a perfect setup. So white tries to keep the tension with bishop to d3. And now, well, now you follow through on the main principle. E takes d5, c takes d5. And what would you do in this position with black? Let's see if you were paying attention during the game. So a lot of you are probably thinking, let's develop with bishop g4. But bishop g4, I'll play h3. And remember, I mentioned this, I think, like 2 speedruns ago. You should make a mental note to yourself that this situation, when you fianchetto your bishop and then you have the other bishop on g4 or g5, is a bit of a liability because you can really never go bishop h5 because you get your bishop trapped. So if you're going bishop g4, then you have to be ready to give up the bishop pair, which could be good. I'm not saying it's bad. But the best move here is actually c6, trying to get rid of this pawn, or at least to make it very weak, because this pawn is, again, making it hard for us to breathe, right? It's not letting us develop. The c7 pawn is a backward pawn. So c6 solves all of the problems in black's position. Now, if white takes, then we take back with the knight. And you might be like, well, isn't this a backward pawn? It is, but you're going to get rid of that weakness very, very quickly by pushing it. Even here, d5 is a perfectly reasonable move, and black is fighting for an advantage. If white doesn't react to the move c6, if white castles, then we play c takes d5. And now white has a very serious weakness on d5. And now bishop g4 is an excellent move. The point being, and I actually see some games in the database, 2,400 against Yuri Kuzubov, 2,600 in this position from a game from 2019. Oh, classical chess. This was a real game. Knight beat at e7. And Kuzubov won this position with black because the knight is coming to e5. You've got this excellent King's Indian bishop. And black is just slightly better. Queen d1 happened in the game. Kuzubov played rook e8. Bishop to g5, h6. Bishop h4. And queen to b6, hitting the pawn. Yeah, black is very, very comfortable here. That's basically how you fight this line, how you disarm this d5 variation, if white plays it properly. And bishop e3 is clearly not a good move. And here we do much the same thing. I started with c6. Now, if white were to go knight c3, there's several things you could do. You could go queen a5, for instance, and put lateral pressure on the pawn, you could just go like d6 and then e6, much like in the main line. But it's, yeah, many ways to play. The basic takeaway is to disarm a pawn that's making life annoying for you, you use your own pawn in order to basically like dynamite it. White blunders the pawn, plays queen c2, we develop. So here we keep the tension. Here we trade in order to be able to play e5 with tempo. Bishop f5, low-hanging fruit tempo move. This blunders another pawn. And in this position, there's, again, many ways that we could play. I decided on c3, queen takes c3, and knight to d5. So again, in the game, it resulted in the win of a piece. And just very, very quickly, knight takes b7 here. We had knight c2 check, intermezzo. White can desperado the queen, but when the smoke clears, we're still up a piece. Pretty simple calculation. Just wanted to point that out. Now, the correct move would have been queen to d2, but after knight takes e3, white cannot recapture the queen. White has to take with a pawn. And this is just an absolutely miserable position. I was planning to go d5 here, just fixing our center. We could entrench a bishop on e4. The other bishop could come out to h6. I mean, if you're not totally convinced, you could set this up, analyze a little bit with the engine, but black is completely winning here. Completely winning here. And look at that bishop. And just look at the board in general. And so even as a beginner, you should kind of start to develop this sort of, this is what intuition is all about, right? One application of intuition is to be able to look at a position like this and within a couple of seconds to conclude that black is completely winning, like -5. That takes some time to develop. So let's fast forward to the last instructive moment. What would have happened after g4? So this is a situation you need to be very, very careful about. I wish I had like an instructive game off the top of my head, which I don't. But anytime a minor piece is defending a heavy piece, and the heavy piece is in close proximity to like a king or a queen, you need to be very careful about these types of deflection tactics. Okay, one very common example of this is like so often missed. Let me see if I can artificially set it up. So let's take like a random, I'm gonna make some random moves, ignore the moves I'm making, just I'm trying to set up the tactic. For instance, I'm talking about a situation like this. Okay, so in a situation like this, actually this works out perfectly. Let's go queen to c2. A lot of people, they go bishop f5 and they say, oh, this is awesome. I'm setting up a discovered attack on the queen. Remember, discovered attacks are double-edged. You can also get bitten. So what is white's best move in this position? Actually, this works nicely. This is a real example. Let's see who's paying attention. White to play. Yeah, g4. G4, attacking the bishop with the pawn. If you take, then you drop the knight. And you might say, oh, but doesn't black have this move? Well, yeah, but again, 2 pieces for a rook in the middle game is just terrible for black. So to contrast that with what we had in the game, after bishop to e4, white pushes f3, and it looks like black has lost a piece. But as a result of white's last 2 pawn moves, look at the dark squares, right? You should just be immediately drawn to how weak the dark squares are and how restricted the king is. There's a checkmating net, and the move is bishop to h6. This is the key, the golden move. And basically, to prevent checkmate, white has to play e3. The line is still not over. If you play bishop takes e3 sloppily, you give up the piece, but you have bishop takes f3 check. This is what I had to calculate to make rook c2 work. I wouldn't really recommend this, though, to people. If you're not sure about a move and you're totally winning, why bother? Right? So only go for something like this if you've confidently calculated it out. Okay. I think that essentially concludes the analysis for this game. We'll get one more game in it, and then I'll call it a day. This will be a bit of a shorter speedrun video. Okay, we have black again against Eden from France. Good luck. Let's go with the Sicilian. Bishop c4. So the most common response by far at this level, as my friend Peter calls it, it's the scholastic variation. In reality, it's called the Bowdler attack. I've analyzed this in detail in previous speedruns, so I'm not going to do it again like from scratch. The basic idea is that bishop c4 is ineffective against the Sicilian for one very simple reason. We have not committed to the move e5. So we can play e6 at any moment, including now, and the bishop just looks really, really stupid on c4, biting on granite. But I like to start with knight c6, just as a flexible developing move to see how white will arrange their pieces. Yeah, and exactly. Queen f3, we have a move that's even better than e6, which immediately takes the bishop pair and essentially makes white look really foolish. What are we talking about here? No, it's not knight to d4 because that blunders mate. It's knight to e5, yeah. So just like remember this concept. Now we're not winning the bishop. White has a million ways to protect the bishop, but we're going to grab the bishop pair, and then very quickly we're going to keep punishing white for bringing the queen out so early. Black is slightly better. Okay, and this is the bonus. At this level, this will often result in simply winning a piece. This is why, even as a beginner, knowing a little bit of opening theory is going to give you a huge boost. Okay, you can see it. Like, this is something that you could just know, even if you're rated 500, and boom, you're up a piece on move 5. Okay, now, the c5 pawn is hanging. White decided not to recapture it. I could bet you a silver dollar their next move is going to be knight to g5. We're not scared of that, so the first order of business for us is to protect the c5 pawn while opening the diagonal for the bishop. I was expecting knight to g5, maybe d3 will follow instead. Silver coin. There we go. So actually, the funny thing is we don't have that many ways to defend the pawn, but we have one very safe way of doing so, and that is, of course, g6. That is obvious. Our opponent is getting excited at the amount of mate threats that they're posing. None of them are scary. Now, I'm keeping a side eye, just in my sort of peripheral vision, I'm keeping an eye on the c4 knight because it's right in the middle of white's territory, and it's susceptible to potentially a lot of forks. So if you want to be really safe, if you want to put on your Russian schoolboy hat here, instead of a move like knight f6 or maybe f6, which you might be thinking about, what's a safer option here? Yeah, just knight back to e5. Just put the knight on a defended square. Development is not as important here because we're up a piece, for goodness sakes. And it's not like white is rushing to develop their pieces either. The development isn't always a race. Queen f4. And now we can really try to go for the win. We can go for the kill really early on. I'm noticing the alignment of the queen and the knight. So it's actually very on theme, this move. I call it the hyperfianchetto. I don't think it has an official name. Yeah, it's when you go like bishop h6 or bishop a6. Very underrated spot for the bishop in a lot of different situations in general. People don't really pay attention to this type of move. Now here the point is obvious. We're threatening to play f6 and pick up a second piece. White is stumbling and bumbling and doesn't have enough pieces in the game. Okay, f6, boom. Yeah, of course, usually bishop g7 is the standard way to play, but all I'm saying is remember that this is an option in some cases to play bishop h6. Okay, thank you for the queen. I think we might even get another game in. I'm just going to play quickly here. Okay, thank you to our opponent for resigning. I have a good illustration of the hyperfianchetto used kind of tactically. Let me see if I can find it. Not much to talk about here. I would refer you to the other Bowdler attack speedrun videos. You can just search Bowdler attack Naroditsky on YouTube, in the YouTube search bar. And I'm pretty sure at least one, if not more, speedrun videos will come up. Yes, what is the Bowdler attack 1 year ago? Crushing bishop c4 with e6, 2 videos, 3. So if you want like a deep theoretical overview, just go through those videos. But the basic idea is that if white plays knight f3, which is the more standard response, you go e6. And then you go knight f6, and you can play this off the cuff. You don't need to know this, but just know that bishop c4 is ineffective because of e6. So queen f3, knight e5. If white played the proper move here, then in this position, we can go either d6, or we can still go e6 and potentially prepare d5. We just have a great position. Or d6. There's a funny move here that white has. Does anybody see a funny move that kind of asks black a question in a weird way? What am I talking about? Yeah, queen b5 check is a weird little move because you can play bishop d7, but you sack a pawn. And it's black's lead in development is not massive here. So I would go queen to d7. But then you have to be ready to play a slightly better endgame. Of course, you have the bishop pair and a nice pawn structure, but still, if you want to keep the queens on the board, maybe e6 is a better idea. I'll let you analyze this position on your own. Of course, our opponent hangs the bishop. Then we play d6, g6, knight e5, safe move, knight on a defended square. I wanted to point one thing out, which is that queen c3 would have been my choice if I had the white pieces. It's a very tricky move, and I had to anticipate it because on the topic of the discovered attack being a double-sided coin, right? This is what people always forget. They think that a discovered situation is always beneficial to the piece of lower value. Not true. Like the bishop is sort of discovering potentially the queen. The queen is doing exactly the same thing to the bishop. So after f4, you get a situation where, at least it appears that, well, the knight has no good squares, because if only the light squared bishop were on g4, then knight f3 would be possible. Knight d3 also impossible. So you can save the piece here with black. No, actually, it's not so easy to do that, because if you play h6, white can very calmly retreat to h3. And amazingly, takes, and still you're stuck in the same situation. Now, of course, you could give this knight up and you're still much, much better because white's position is in shambles. But that's a different story. The best move here is actually to go knight f6. And now f4 is no longer anything to write home about. You can just drop the knight back. And white's quote-unquote attack fizzles out before it begins. Takes, knight d5. That's it. No more threats. What if f6? Oh, maybe I did miss an option. Oh yeah, f6. Great job. Oh, f6 is absolutely correct. I guess I took Ben Feingold's wisdom to heart. Yes, great stuff by the chat. f6, I didn't see that move. Saving the piece. Yes, it's possible with the move f6. And now if the knight drops back, you can already move your knight. Great catch. If you spotted this, pat yourself on the back. But why bother with this, right? Knight f6 exists. It's easy. And here the hyper fianchetto with bishop h6. Now, there's many reasons that you might want to play a move like bishop h6. They could be tactical, like in this game. You're pinning the knight and setting up f6. But they could also be positional. And here's one of like 1,000 examples that I could give you of, in my opinion, a cool application of the hyper fianchetto. Just remembering that the bishop is not always just like stuck to g2, if that makes sense. You have to be flexible in your thinking in that regard. I don't know why the players are not showing up, but this is Pickett versus Timon 1996. So both of these players are strong GMs. Timon is still active. So in this position, it's a King's Indian attack, and people watching this on YouTube who are familiar with the King's Indian, there should be a move that's sort of at the tip of your tongue straight off the bat. What are we talking about here? There's a very typical plan that you kind of execute, which is to do what? Which is to play f4. Yeah, f4, starting sort of the kingside operation, and Timon responds with f6. And here we reach the critical moment. Now, most of you watching this are like, let's go f5 and let's go attack the king. What king? Black is not castled to the kingside yet, so this is a classic mistake where you assume your opponent is going to go the way that you want them to go, but black can actually go queenside here. And now you kind of look foolish for pushing these pawns, which now suddenly become targets for black. So here, Piquet actually makes a very deep positional move. And I call this a positional tactic. It's a positional move. So the move is aimed at achieving something strategic, but it has a tactical underpinning to it. What are we talking about here? If you've been paying attention to why I'm even showing in this game, you might be primed to find this move. What is this game an example of? Chess. Yeah, you got it. Yeah, bishop h3. Bishop h3 in this position. Now, tactical underpinning, that means bishop takes h3, which was what happened in the game. Queen h5 check picks up the bishop. Why is this trade beneficial to white? Well, it's very obvious just to the naked eye. White's bishop on g2 was really stupid, just staring at the pawn. Black's bishop was an excellent piece, just kind of stabilizing piece. By trading it, white is weakening the light squares. The queen can now infiltrate to e6, and black just generally has more weaknesses on the king side. White went on to win the game. That's exactly what happened. The queen infiltrated, and black immediately was in trouble. I can give you a sneak preview from my Chessable King's Indian course, which is currently being prepared. Just like literally before I went live, I was analyzing a position in which this same concept occurs. Basic idea, this position will occur in the Chessable course. So it's black to play, and you don't have any context, so it can be hard to like understand what's going on. The bottom line is that you play in this position, knight takes c5. And if white gives the bishop away, and this is very common in the King's Indian, the dark squares are weakened. What is the best move in this position? This move wins immediately. It just ends the game. it is once again the move bishop to h6. Again, hyper fianchetto, the bishop is coming to e3, and it's essentially just checkmate right off the bat. Okay, so I think I made my point. Fianchetto doesn't only mean bishop g7. You could also put the bishop on h6, a3, etc. And that can be very, very effective.